There is a notion of progress in the Bible. I mean, where did Martin Luther King Jr. get his idea that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice? Well, he got it from Theodore Parker, who was a Christian preacher, who got it from the prophets, essentially, and got it from the fact of resurrection. Through the cross out we come.
Working in our local church, where I'd say actually in Britain today, and it might not be the same in every nation, but in Britain today, the centre of gravity of my church would seem to be well on the left on issues of racial justice, would seem to be well on the right on issues of sexual ethics and pro-life, would seem to be various places in between on all sorts of other public policy issues. And we're going to provide a radical, biblical, gospel-shaped critique of all the principalities and powers.
Hello and welcome to Post-Christianity. My name is Glen Scrivener.
And I'm Andrew Wilson.
Together we're thinking about our cultural moment in historical context, and we're trying to figure out how we got here and what we do now, because you've written a wonderful book called Remaking Our World. Is it how 1776
created the post-Christian West?
Created the post-Christian West. So my first question to you, Andrew, is, are you saying that the founding of America is in fact a post-Christian founding in the sense that we're talking about it?
I was bound to lose us, most of our listeners in America. But I think in many ways, yes. I mean, I don't think it's as much of an innovation as that makes it sound. I mean, I do think I'd used the language in a previous episode of Protestant paganism. Yes. And I think the Declaration of Independence is actually a very good example of that, because it's, and actually even the way it was designed is a kind of combination of very deistic or Unitarian and quite heretical Christians, or would-be Christians, but a lot of deists really, mingled with actually a very strong Protestant dissenting impulse, Congregationalists, Baptists and the like, and Presbyterians. And the two come together to make the Declaration. And I do think that in a sense it is assuming a lot of Christian ideas at the same time as saying these are now standard and we're going to move beyond, and we are explicitly not going to look for, not just in the state, but in the kind of society we build, look for explicitly religious ideas to be at the heart of it in a way that we recognise, acknowledge and shape society around. Instead, we can say we can assume these things and we'll put them there. I don't think it's as much of the key innovation in a sense is probably the Protestant Reformation. And in a way, as soon as you get the Protestant Reformation, you're probably going to end up with, in the end, a society that has to, if they decide they don't want to be fighting all the time about religion, then you have to have some way of forming a would-be neutral space. And of course, it's not neutral, but that's the attempt. And it's probably a more resilient attempt to do it in America than there has been there certainly was in Europe at the time. And it's lasted a long time, so it's been very influential. But yes, I do think that in a sense that was a certainly post-Christendom move. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously got huge implications for not just America, but the rest of the world ever since.
And so we've got these tensions that you name, and the tension between a kind of a Christian founding and a post-Christian founding already happening, and the other tension that we're thinking about, which is slavery.
Yeah.
Right there, here's Thomas Jefferson owning 600 slaves as he writes the Declaration of Independence. How is slavery playing out on either side of the Atlantic?
So Britain, in the late 18th century, obviously slavery has been around since forever. And it begins to be challenged. And the first sort of strident abolitionist writers are writing sort of late 17th into the 18th century. Initially, it's Quakers. It's sort of sectarian Christian groups who are not part of the established church. And it quite quickly spreads. And you end up with quite a strong dissenting abolitionist tradition quite early. And then it goes mainstream, really. People would debate exactly, but in Britain, which is probably the first and most influential country to go, we're going to push heavier in that direction. You sort of got 1760s and 1770s through to obviously abolition of the slave trade comes in 1807, and then slavery overall in the early 1830s. But that tradition is coming through. So you have people like Granville Sharp and then John Wesley. They're very significant men in their own standing of in church influence, but it is reaching the culture more widely. And of course, through the influence of Methodism and popular evangelicalism, the influence of the church is much larger in that sense, of the dissenting church is much larger than it would be in Britain today. So you have that strong momentum in Britain. It gets coupled, and the timing comes in. Obviously, the European Enlightenment is giving other reasons to oppose slavery within the French radical intellectual tradition. And so you get these unlikely bedfellows, which of course do also exist in the States. It's just that in the States, there's so much more at stake for them, right? And or so much more at stake for the white powerful folk who are basically running the country and writing all these documents, that they generally, there's a lot of, well, of course, this would be better if it wasn't here, but it is, and then you initially get that. And then, of course, later, as people realize our whole livelihood might be at stake here, things like the cotton gin and these sort of technologies make you think we can make a lot of money out of this, and they begin to celebrate slavery rather than just apologize for it. And of course, that becomes a huge explosion in the US in the 1860s. And that's not just so. Effectively, every nation's been scarred by a history on slavery. All European nations have, but because in the States it was on the land and it was abolished much later than it was in most of Western Europe, it became much more of a moral stain and with moral implications that continue today. They still do in Britain as well. They still do in other European nations, but I think without a lot of the sort of the sense of presentness, it feels more distant. And obviously, Western European nations didn't process post-slavery in the same way either. So there wasn't the equivalent of a Jim Crow or whatever. That sort of just the horrible history of lynchings and that sort of thing is far, far rarer. It's not unknown in Western Europe, but it's just dramatically less than it was in the US. So these two sides of the Atlantic head down quite different paths. I don't think ultimately that's because of the tension I'm talking about in the Declaration and the Constitution. I think that's really because they just had a lot. It was easier for Britain. It cost Britain less.
Right.
And it cost Western European nations less to say we're going to abolish slavery, because in the end, the people passing the laws are in the main not the ones profiting from slavery, whereas in America they were.
Right.
And it's that Upton Sinclair line, isn't it? It's very difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on him not understanding it. And I think there was a lot of that in the States. It's a complex issue, of course, but that's a sort of a summary of how the next 70 years played out.
Yeah. And so 1807, abolition of the slave trade, and 1833 is sort of the emancipation of the slaves in the UK. Fascinatingly, in order to export this view of slavery and its evil beyond Britain and into Catholic lands and Muslim lands, there was the use of the language of this is a crime against humanity, which I think was a very politically wise tactic to sort of say, why is slavery, wrong? And the sort of Muslim sultans in Morocco saying this, we've had this since the time of Adam. Why would we not have slavery?
Yeah.
And it was politically wise and astute to say this is a crime against humanity, which is a sort of phrase that has passed down to us in a number of different ways, including as sort of the crime that sort of Nazis were, guilty of, these crimes against humanity. But it's another example of things that began in a Christian register in terms of the abolitionists, and people like Alec Ryrie would absolutely say this is a Christian movement, Quakers and evangelicals and nonconformists leading the way. But this is a Christian movement that, in order to be translated to a global movement, has to anonymize its Christianity. I think in the way that it does that, we are then left with an absurdity in terms of a crime against humanity. Because if humanity is the guilty party, is humanity also the judge? Is humanity also the law? Is humanity also the advocate?
And the victim?
And the victim.
Yeah.
This case would get thrown out of court. Like if this was the, and yet it's a way of, like with Benjamin Franklin and Sacred and Undeniable, of bringing the standard down, all the way down to our level so that it's uncontestable.
Yeah.
And yet to do that makes it not self-evident and slightly absurd, really.
Yeah.
And I think that's an example of ways in which profoundly Christian things become universalized and anonymized and then invisible.
Yes.
So that we now take it for granted. What's interesting is about what now seems so obvious to us, which is the freedom of all people and people are not property. What is so obvious to us morally and is one of our firmest convictions, no matter whether we're Christian or not, it's so difficult to think ourselves into the shoes of a Thomas Jefferson with 600 slaves. We think, well, how could he do it?
Yeah.
But that just, again, shows how Christianized we've become.
It does. I think Jefferson is fascinating because he spoke against it and still did it. Yeah. And that, I think, there we're going, is hypocrisy it seems obviously hypocritical, but is that the best category? And Thomas Kidd's work on this is really fascinating. And it's not quite the same as hypocrisy. It's a bit more complicated than that. But I think the general thing is not just that we can't understand Jefferson being a hypocrite. It's more that we can't understand anyone wanting to own slaves, even if they weren't hypocritical. It's more, how did anybody ever think this was acceptable? It's interesting. Do you know when the last nation on earth to abolish slavery happened? Do you know when was the last nation on earth to formally abolish slavery? It was 1970 or something. It was exactly 200 years after it was abolished in Britain. So in 2007 in Mauritania, which is absolutely extraordinary, I think.
Wow.
But now, obviously, that's to show that it takes a while for these ideas to spread, but and effectively for them to be imposed from outside on cultures that didn't necessarily want to go there by effectively force of personality and at times force of arms and trade embargoes by Western nations. But you're right; it's not remotely self-evident. It hasn't been self-evident to most people in history that slavery is unacceptable, and you've got to be said. And it wasn't self-evident to most Christians that slavery was unacceptable for a lot of that period as well. But it's the moral logic of Christianity running amok, and then getting forgotten that it is ultimately the moral logic of Christianity. But the fact that now somebody was to say, I'd like to make the case for slavery in the public square would be so unthinkable, not just in Britain, but in countries that have never actually been Christianized countries, shows how universalized that idea has become. And so there are many other examples we have, and of course they all come through, as we've touched on previously, in the language of human rights, or the idea that you can have a crime against humanity, you can have a right of being a human. You often see posters up now saying every child has a right to play as well as to eat and to survive. And you sort of think even the way in which human beings have abstract things that must be true of them as humans and abstract things that must not ever be done to them because they're humans derive from Christian assumptions, not just about humans, but about God and about Jesus. And so, yeah, I mean, we've touched on this a number of times from different angles, but I do think the abolition of slavery and human rights discourse, and even just when people came in the years after the Second World War to say, how do we best describe what has happened in Germany and elsewhere is so utterly unthinkable without playing the God card. Right. Well, we will need to transpose the same moral fervor into a secular key, hence for me the category of Protestant paganism. You're trying to our worldview, our metaphysics is pagan, but actually our moral fervor and logic is ultimately Protestant and at least Christian. So we're going to fuse the two together and come up with the UN Declaration of Human Rights and many other things which, of course, are not ultimately grounded in the materialist premises that the people who wrote them mainly held. Held. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question I'll ask now, actually, and it's a question that also relates to UN Declaration of Human Rights and where we get to in the 20th century. But what do we do with conscience? What do we do with the sense that the Bible speaks of this thing? It's not an unerring moral compass in our breast that always points towards due north. And it can't be that because there are slaveholders who had no qualms about holding slaves. And when they write their diaries, you don't get the sense that they're sort of internally wrestling with this thing and that they've got Jiminy Cricket on their shoulder saying, you can't do this, you're a monster. Like they're not, they don't seem to be, and you go back to the ancient world and there are people thinking that the gladiatorial games were vulgar, but
not morally abhorrent.
Immoral? Yeah. Like in that sense, you've got that famous letter from a soldier in the 1st century writing to his wife, and he's like, I know that you're pregnant. If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, kill it. I'll be home by spring and say hello to Alexander. It's kind of, and you don't get that sense that people are actually churned up by this moral struggle with the evil of infanticide or blood sports or slavery. So what is the conscience then?
Wow. So I think you're right that there is no the moral law or the sense that we are violating it is clearly not the same. It's obviously not the same in all cultures, that morality is understood in such radically different ways, just as in our own culture. Many people would say there's absolutely nothing morally unacceptable about abortion or whatever. People have things that other cultures go, how on earth can you think that? And our cultures go, well, But I think nevertheless, I think the sense of conscience, which is obviously heavily fashioned by the culture we're in, but conscience functions as a prompt from a part of our soul or a part of our brain, you might say, to another part of our brain to say, it's often you're not living up to the standard that you yourself hold. That's what the conscience does. I think it doesn't provide an abstracted code of laws. It's more like the prosecuting lawyer or the judge who goes, by your own standards, you have fallen short. And so I think it's rather than the lawmaker, if you see what I mean. It plays the part, in a sense, I guess, of the judiciary rather than the legislative. It doesn't make the laws. The laws are given to it largely by the culture it's in. But what it does is to apply the law to the soul of the person and say, oi, Glenn, you said that and you don't actually think that's right. Rather than I'm from nowhere going to give you a sort of, on tablets of stone, here's the law that you've broken. Now, I do think that God can speak anyway through the individual and say that is wrong, even though your culture thinks it's right. And there's clearly, abolitionism is a good example where there are people in a culture where everybody does think it's okay, who nevertheless take huge personal risk to confront and challenge and say, no, this is not okay, and I'm going to lose an awful lot on saying that it isn't. But I think that can't be all conscience is. So I think conscience, if I use that analogy, I think it's the application of and the taking of the law and applying it to the soul of the person who knows they've broken it. And that, I think, if you go to your Romans 1 and 2, that's what's going on, is that you condemn these things and you yourself do the same things. That's how the conscience is going, oi, you, because you're guilty by your own moral standard.
Yeah. And it's informed by revelation, and it can go wrong, and it errs, and we can have our consciences seared, and we can contort them, and yes. So it's not this unerring sense that everyone living through slavery was always thinking this is wrong, but we're making a lot of money, so let's do it.
Yes.
It's a lot more complicated than that. Okay, so we're through into the 19th century, kind of the century of progress.
Yeah.
And we've got some great...
in scare quotes.
In scare quotes, yeah, exactly. So I guess we've got the idea of people like Hegel, who would say we've got historical progress in the dialectic, and history kind of goes on like that. Darwin famously in sort of biological process. Freud had a sort of an idea of cultural and spiritual and psychological kind of progress and that kind of thing. But you say
Marx, I think.
Marx, absolutely,
crucial,
absolutely.
Which is more of an economic take on it, and again applying Hegel into the concept of into matter, really.
And would you say that what is making those narratives of progress very plausible is all sorts of material circumstances going on?
Absolutely. So and this is the thing, that if the world you're in, I mean, you see this with so many things. You see that the way that the environment and the material conditions of humanity, and sometimes the environment literally in the sense of, we've touched on in previous episodes, of geography and weather and those sorts of things. But certainly if your machinery is doubling in its power every 10 or 15 years, it only needs that for a few decades, and the dramatic expansion of material wealth. We talked about industrialization and enrichment, but those two prongs shape the moral frame, the way that people think we are clearly getting better. It's quite hard to deny that we're getting better. We're getting more educated, and there becomes a self-fulfilling, almost like a reinforcing feedback loop, where the more money you have, the more you can give people time and space to research things and discover things, which then leads, and it did at least for about 100, 150 years. I think you'd probably say there's an S-curve. It's probably slowed in many areas in the last 50 or 70 years. But just, you take the obvious thing, what would a person alive in 1800 have experienced in their day-to-day life that by their children or grandchildren's time would have been unthinkably backward? And you realize, of course, the world these people live in is conditioning them economically, in terms of their levels of wealth, their machinery, their comfort, their healthcare, their life expectancy, their earnings, the amount of land they have, how productive it is, so many different things. You realize it's actually quite difficult for somebody who is alive who has lived from 1810 to 1865 or whatever, not to think, gosh, humanity's making enormous strides in the right direction, and it's all upwards towards the light. Now, I think what's interesting is that the language, as we've touched on previously, the language of being in a world now of light predates that economic dramatic change, the Enlightenment really. But what happens is, if you've got a narrative that goes, we are, as we've seen in previous episodes, we are light and they were darkness, and since turning the lights on, we have dramatically enhanced, we've doubled our life expectancy, or very nearly, and our wealth is exploding exponentially. Then, of course, you do have and at the same time, European wars on the continent of Europe pretty much, fizzle out for best part of a century. And if you have that, you start thinking, oh, well, actually, peace. I mean, I know, obviously, we've got a few things to cough about and splutter about. I know we're not quite at peace over there in this land or whatever, in China or in Crimea or whatever. But generally, we've got increased we've started to believe we're morally progressing, which the Victorians in Britain clearly did. The great American philanthropists and that, we've made a lot of money, but now we're going to invest it for the good of humanity. Couple that with educational progress, material, industrial progress, you think it would actually be almost impossible to imagine how they wouldn't have concluded, we're just getting better and better. And people then will, the end point of that, it hits the buffers depending on how you count, but in the years immediately before or maybe during World War I, people start going, I think we may have omitted some important things. But in Europe, at least, I am speaking very much from a northern, the weirder world we've been considering, you do have a period of 100 years where you think it's if you were removed from the dark side, so you're removed from the rapaciousness and the greed and the resource extraction and the death and the colonialism and the slavery, if you can't see that, you're just living in a world where, of course you have poor people, but even those poor people are themselves over a generation getting wealthier. Yeah. And maybe more educated, and maybe more better manners and cleaner, and all. And
you're passing reforms the whole time,
and saying, actually, so now children can't go up chimneys, and now of course you do need to provide more for the poor laws, and you end up with you can see how people concluded. This is going to keep going in this direction,
and you've turned that corner from slavery to abolition, and oh my goodness,
and many equivalents. So which is why I think those years immediately around, sort of the 1910s. Titanic is often quoted as sort of almost like but more of a parable than as a genuine sense of, oh gosh, we've completely messed this up. But World War I is a horrible shock, as it would have been to any generation. But I think particularly there, because the methods, the price of European progress that until then was being paid in the Belgian Congo in making rubber, or being in Southwest Africa or whatever, and all over the world, sugar plantations. But they couldn't see it and they weren't experiencing it. But now they can, and they're saying, wow, these machines we've developed. Well, the stat I quote in the book, for every mile of railway track in the world today, there are 100 AK-47s. And so you start to see the other side of the technology you've created.
Right.
And obviously classically through to Hiroshima and beyond. So that story comes to a shuddering halt in the First World War and the years other side of it.
So the century of progress gives way to the murder century, 20th century, in which more people died violently than in all the other centuries of human history put together. Quite a shocking thing. And in one sense, I think with World War II, we've sort of now had our successor mythology in terms of a grand battle with evil. And Tom Holland is always making the point that, now that we've had the Nazis, we don't need demons anymore. Now that we've got Hitler, we don't need the devil. Now that we've had Auschwitz, we don't need hell. And there's a certain telling of the story in which the Atlantic Charter is signed in 1941 between Roosevelt and Churchill, and it's let's go to war against this evil in the name of human rights. And, they're even sort of explicitly kind of saying that. And it turns out that to be on the other side of human rights is to be a Nazi. And in a sense, I think, since World War II, we haven't exactly had a pole star to guide ourselves by, because, absent Christian faith, that is not our transcendent value. But we do have a pit now to avoid. And that pit is called Auschwitz. And so we don't know what's up, but we do know what's down. And what's fascinating about the UN Declaration of Human Rights is, like, the preamble is very heavy on, we've seen the barbarism of what happens when we do not affirm human rights. And therefore we express our faith in human rights. And again, it's not so much... And it uses the words, they use the words of crimes against humanity when they're Nuremberg trials and they're convicting the Nazis. And again, it's bringing those standards right down to the very human level. Because otherwise, you don't want to be a Nazi, do you? And, Alec Ryrie, who I've, just mentioned, just sort of said, our whole moral settlement has just become, don't be a Nazi. And there's a reason why Godwin's rule is a rule in online discussion. It's the probability that a comparison to Hitler will be made by the end of an internet thread, approaches one, because, it's not so much what would Jesus do and do Jesus anymore. It's what would Hitler do and do the opposite. How much of our moral imagination do you think has been shaped by that as a kind of as our new mythology?
I think it's hard to think of any area of moral reflection that hasn't been. So in that sense, it is. I entirely agree with that. I was Alec Ryrie where I first came across that idea that was the sort of the most significant moral figure for the 21st century person is not Jesus but Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
And that's literally is the anti-Christ. He's the not in the Christian theological sense, although I guess that too in 1 John sense, but more as this is how you define your morality, look at that and then do the opposite. And even in the sense of, the way in which we think about some of the moral conflicts and anxieties today. I'll say, so Hitler persecuted and mass murdered Jews. So how then do we think through the rights, not just of Jewish people, but of any oppressed people and on the grounds of effectively racism? Whereas we'd say, well, Stalin killed an awful lot of his own people, but because it wasn't motivated by racism, it was motivated by the desire to say, no, everyone's equal, animal farm style. It's not as morally repugnant to us, even though actually the death count might even have been higher in communist Russia than it was, and probably was, than it was in Nazi Germany. Similarly with, sexuality, and similarly with other kinds of minorities, you say, actually the last 80 years have seen the people who were being attacked by Hitler often take center stage in moral reasoning. Now, not in an entirely one-sided way either, obviously, and particularly with the history of Israel, it's become much, you get the left now very confused as to what to do with the nation of Israel in various ways, because the narrative is anybody who's a victim now needs to be elevated, but then what happens if how do you trade those two rights against each other? But I think the moral grammar of Western reflection without the sort of effect is still fundamentally a Christian take on morality. God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the strong. That's the shape of it.
Yep.
But how do you tell who's on which side? And the answer is, well, little men with moustaches who want to kill everybody are on this side, and anyone who persecutes the same group of people are also with him. And then these are the victims, and then of course that then gets run through the filters of sexuality and race and most other culturally hot potato issues today, and that charge gets thrown every which way. And I don't think that's simply a laziness in debate. It clearly is. It's a conversation stopper. It's a way of avoiding difficult conversations. But ultimately, it does reflect that is the sort of moral center of gravity, or the opposite, whatever the center of gravity, like a magnet that pushes you away. That sort of thing. Yes,
repulsive. Yeah.
And I don't know. I think without a more explicit theism or a more explicit appeal to Jesus, it's difficult to know how you would end up with a positive account of morality. So what we effectively have is the negative account of morality flipped.
Yes.
And I think that is a large part of how, most of the people who I've interacted with on social media in the last 10 years, even if they've been very mature about it, that's still ultimately how the moral frame is being motivated and where a lot of the animus and force behind those convictions comes from.
Yes. And it also explains why, if you're having a conversation about, where do you think human rights come from? What's fascinating is a number of times I've had conversations like that, and literally the comeback has been, why are you questioning human rights? It's like, no, I just want to intellectually kind of get...
What sort of a Nazi are you, Glenn? Exactly, yeah.
What are you, a Nazi? And what's fascinating is that kind of is the preamble to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Like, you don't want to be a Nazi, do you? Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess, we better go for this bulwark against the baddies. But just simply to invert to the Antichrist is not to revert you back to Christ, which unfortunately. And
I think it's just to riff on that. I think one of it was fascinating. We talked a little bit about even sometimes the differences between America and Western Europe on the speed of cultural change here, the sort of rapidity of post-Christendom in America being sort of a lot has happened in the last 10 years, which has been happening in Europe since the 1950s or whatever. And, various things of, de-churching or of just, the toxicity or apparent toxicity of Christian truth claims in the public square and so on. But one of the reasons is because I think in America, the way the Cold War played out meant that you actually had two enemies. And so we're here, we're liberal democracy, we've got the fascists there, we've also got the communists there, and they're also the baddies. In Western Europe, although you're still involved in the Cold War, the moral opposition to fascism was immeasurably greater than it was in communism. And what's happened since the end of the Cold War is that obviously communism has faded to a sort of, it feels arcane almost to talk about that, and it's a bit more of a footnote. And so I think one of the things that almost preserved American sort of apparent nominal Christianity for longer was, and in all sorts of ways, was the Cold War, because but then when you take that out, you realize in my adult lifetime how quickly it looks like America's moved. It's almost was being held with something that looked more Christian rather than simply anti-fascist for a lot longer because of the desire to fend off equal and opposing opposites.
Yes.
In the form of fascism and communism, whereas in Britain, even though people were still, we obviously don't want to be like the communists, but the things that people, were mainstream in political discourse in the 60s and 70s in Britain were a lot closer to, it wasn't anything like as reprehensible to be a communist in the 1970s as to be an avowed fascist in a country like Britain, whereas in America they were almost seen as morally equivalent, and I think that's made quite a big difference to the speed of post-Christendom suddenly cascading upon a lot of our American brothers and sisters quite quickly. That in Britain has just taken 8 or 9 decades.
Yes, because church attendance percentage-wise peaked in America in the 1950s, whereas in Britain it was in the 1850s.
Yeah,
and we were. I
didn't know that. That's very interesting.
We were sort of like 50% in the 1851 census in Britain. And in America, because of the Cold War threat, there is this massive, we need to, in God we trust, which went on the money in the 1950s.
Yeah.
It wasn't on the money before then. And so Christianity was kind of more of a bulwark against communism and that sort of thing. But other things happening in the 50s and 60s, I guess we've got two, lots of things going on, but there's a civil rights movement and there's a sexual revolution going on. And what's interesting to me is the way in which those two things kind of get unified in our thinking, when actually they're quite separate movements happening for quite separate reasons.
They are.
Help us with what's going on with the civil rights movement and the sexual revolution.
So I think the civil rights movement is obviously there is a global dimension to it, but when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're almost exclusively talking about the US in the sense of what we mean by it and all the key figures for us, and so whether we think whether Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and so on, and that of course is going back really to the legacy of slavery and well before that, and all that's happened since. As I said, the post slave, when you would think in the 1860s we've settled the issue, we now don't have slaves anymore, but Reconstruction very quickly loses its original ideal and turns into another means of keeping African Americans as second-class citizens and worse for the next 80-odd years, 100 years. And so civil rights is very much motivated by the redress of that, and obviously is very much, to continue with our theme, is very much an explicitly Christian movement, not just in its moral logic, as we've said, but also in its, a lot of its most foremost spokespersons and really the appeal and even rhetoric and cadences of the civil rights movement are, Baptist preachers and the like. Whereas the sexual revolution had a very different sort of prehistory. In some ways, it roots from not a dissimilar time span. I think you still have the origins of both of these things, abolitionism and what I call the first sexual revolution, bubbling away in the sort of late 18th century, and then having a sort of surge forward in the West sort of through the late 19th and early 20th century, and then obviously come into legal fruition in the 1960s and 70s, and then a more cultural normalization for everybody in the last 10 or 20 years in many ways. Because the sexual revolution still, most people were in the 1960s were still not going, okay, there's some people over there practicing free love and all this, but that isn't how most ordinary folk were living, and in many ways still isn't, but people are, the mainstream are always more conservative than the people on the front page of the papers. But obviously the logic was very different, and it was about primarily, at best the liberation of women and about the equalization of rights. But the journey there was motivated by different abuses. It was far more stop-start over the 150 years, and it was much more global, in the sense that the similar sort of trajectories were taking place all over the world. Whereas in the civil rights context, it was much the racial dynamics of the United States in particular gave not just force to the moral imperative to do it, but even to the particular ways in which it played out and the policy implications. Sexual revolution was more of a global, or at least Western global phenomenon that is now obviously in many ways has been exported globally to most parts of the world. And so I think there's a number of important differences that even though we would, again, with a very flat Christian influence telling of the story, there were these people who were being victimized by these people, the white patriarchy was oppressing everybody, and one by one they all rose up and said, no, we're going to have to. That's the way they can sort of look like the same sexual minorities, women, African Americans, whoever it was. It looks like the same kind of dynamics at work in each case. But of course, that's not the way in which the laws that were passed and the implications were not like that at all. Women in legal equality for women in something like voting came a lot earlier than it did in civil rights. But actually, the sort of pay differential might still exist today. And so it's a much more protracted process with very different causes behind it.
Yeah. And there's a great difficulty when we conflate those two things. At that point, we just say, well, if they're both the same story, then there is a domineering culture, let's say white slave owners and blacks who are being enslaved, and therefore liberation looks like this. And then you just transpose the story into the sexual revolution, and you've got heteronormativity up here and everybody else. Yeah. And we need to do the same kind of liberation. And I guess in modern cultures, it tends to be that those on the progressive left are A-OK on civil rights issues and race issues, and they want to see further progress, as they would see it in liberation of sexual minorities and that kind of thing. And those on the right take the opposite view on both those things, and yet it's a far more complicated thing than that.
It is, and I think again, there's plenty of people who sort of cross party lines all the time, and they just get sort of erased from the narrative. But if you were, as of course an awful lot of people in my church would be, who'd be saying, my church would be sort of 70% black, and from people, about a third of the church from Africa, a third of the church from the Caribbean or Black British background, a third of the church from elsewhere in the world. A bunch of us are white as well, of course. But in a setting like that, where people would say actually on sexual ethics, I would appear to be very conservative relative to the progressive narrative of today. But on racial issues, seem to be very progressive and would seem to be sort of hyper woke in some people's speech, on one issue and extremely retrograde on another issue. So I might simultaneously be regarded as woke or a bigot depending on what I was talking about. Now, that's not unique to my church at all. It's probably represented in every church of every person listening to this. But it's very prominent in my community in South East London. And so you look at that from the outside and go, well, that just shows that the narrative is clearly being told in a very misleading way, in such a way as to really appropriate and swallow up into the Borg everybody who is in any way saying historical injustices have been committed by Group A against Group B, therefore we need to advance the rights of Group B, which actually on the face of it is a perfectly legitimate policy platform. It's what a lot of people do. But of course the issue is, but a lot of the rights of people in Group B might exist for different reasons and might be in conflict with one another. A lot of the people in Group A had very different motivations, very different prehistories, and also a lot of people in Group B might say, well, that is not a rights issue. That's an issue of sin and righteousness. That's an issue of wisdom and prudence. In fact, there's another victim here, an unborn child, for instance, which you haven't considered in that analysis, and so on. So it's so much more complicated than it has been made to look.
Yes.
But I think, again, there's sort of it is quite Christian, and there's the dark side, the light side. It's quite morally black and white. It's just that what is black and what is white has been transformed and subtly adjusted in the course of the last couple of generations. And it has enormous rhetorical power, because at the end, all of us want to believe that we would have been on the right side at Selma. Or Soweto, or wherever it was. We want to be. I would have been marching with Martin Luther King. I wouldn't have been firing water cannons in their faces. But today, there's no Selma. Today, the equivalent of that is Stonewall, or the equivalent to that is trans rights, or whatever. And so, but I want to make sure I'm on the right side of that.
Yeah.
But of course, that narrative itself is a historical slice, which sounds plausible today because of our immediate history, but really for much of history, and you would think even today, does not reflect the complexities of most of those issues. And the tables turn. And you see that with J.K. Rowling. You see that we've talked about, I know both really enjoyed Louise Perry's work. Many examples where you'd say, hang on a second, there's a lot of debate about who's actually being victimized by who here. It's not, we'd like it to be, we've got Bull Connor over here and Martin Luther King over there on every issue. And it's not remotely like that in many of them. It's the fascinating impulse to make goodies and baddies, which I guess we all have, has been particularly effective in that kind of moral discourse.
Yeah, and when you think about some of the corners that we have turned, and that we would look back over hundreds of years and see a positive corner has been turned on something like blood sports and gladiatorial games. I mean, that's a very conservative thing, Telemachus, this monk, sort of goes into the arena and he tries to stop these two gladiators doing their thing, and he gets stoned to death by the crowd. It's not a popular thing.
No, sure. Progressivism is often what we would now. So teetotalism, anti-prohibitionism was a very progressive movement. Eugenics at the time is like abhorrent to us now, but was all the best progressive minds of the day were into it. Yes. Opposing vaccinations for all sorts of reasons was a very progressive thing to do.
Even scientific racism.
Like even at the start of the COVID pandemic, it was fascinating. The conservatives and the progressives in February or January 2020 were at opposite sides of the lockdown, masking, vaccines, all those, a lot of those debates, than you would think they were if you looked at it from 2023.
Yeah, and shutting down borders kind of flipped.
Exactly, yeah, of course, that was a very repressive measure, and now it's a sort of, no, this is a good, that's what that's what New Zealand's doing, that sort of thing. So,
my body, my choice became a slogan of the left, as regards, abortion, but a slogan of the right as regards vaccinations,
And so, again, this sort of, the idea that there is I trust everyone knows that the inexorable march of history in one direction is hopelessly shallow, but people do still talk about that. And the fact that the phrase right side of history is ever used shows that there is an appealing and actually a very Christian influenced moral logic to the idea that history is heading in the right direction. And of course, that's just not how most of the issues we touched on play out at all.
Yeah. And especially because you look back at the banning of blood sports, for instance, that sounds like a very conservative movement. And, outlawing infanticide, again, sounds like a restriction from one sense, but isn't it the liberation of the children? Like, on what side is that a progressive or a conservative cause? Abolition of slavery seems like a very progressive cause, I guess. And you just can't pin down, like, on which side of our political spectra would those causes be placed?
Yeah.
Over history, and I guess there's no kind of safe place on those political spectra.
No, there isn't, and I think if I can, jump back to the 18th century for a moment, I think one of the things driving that is the French Revolution, which we haven't really talked about, where you do have, which is where our language of left and right comes from, the left and right banks of the Seine, and where I think you do have a clear split. Within the French Revolution, depending on how you count, but the intense phase lasts 4 or 5 years, and quite quickly evolves from a sort of quite moderate middle class balanced. Let's just put it some checks and balances. We'll keep a king. We're obviously through something that would have looked actually more like what the Americans did and what the British did under Cromwell, but quite quickly turned into a much more radical self-immolating movement. And I think the sense of what left and right is and how radical, how opposed you are to the old.
Right.
There's actually almost a chronological logic to what the French Revolution has bequeathed to us. That effectively, if I said to you, you've got left and right and you've got looking forwards and looking backwards, you would immediately know that left belonged to looking forwards and right belonged to looking backwards, even if you thought there's no reason why that would obviously be true. That's what those terms are intended to mean. And right side of history is clearly a forward-looking, this is how the world will be.
Right side of history is the left.
Yeah, exactly. Of course it is. No one on the right says you want to be on the right side of history unless they're doing it to troll people on the left. And I think that is really the sort of almost chronological logic, inelegant phrase, of the French Revolution being imposed and still using language of left, right, even though that language now is really sort of disintegrates a little bit, really. Do left and right really argue that much about the size of the state? Does anybody
Taxation.
Really think, the issues about which people are left and right now seem very different from what they would have been. But I think that's partly where that comes from, because there was an ancien régime, and was also a progressive new world. We're going to bring in the new thing, and we're going to desecrate the temples and replace it with the Temple of Reason, and Notre Dame and all that sort of is now going to be a place to come and gather and worship the brilliance of the human spirit and how much we know. And even though that quickly blew itself out and turned into Napoleon, it still bequeathed a sense that there are people in the world who look forward and who want justice and who are prepared to overthrow and chop people's heads off if they get in the way of it. Yeah. And that terminates in a sort of communism kind of direction. And then you've got people who look backwards, which you obviously want to preserve, and nostalgia, and keep all the old things and keep the nasty downtrodden people as downtrodden as can be, so that we can retain our privilege. And that would, in the modern mind, terminate in fascism. And I think that framing still hovers in the back of our mind, even though we know that Labour and Conservative or Republican Democrat isn't really about the same issue at all.
Right. And certainly at the elite level, at the journalistic level, in terms of media, we sort of lean left on these things because we don't want to be Hitler. We don't want to go the fascistic route. And we're kind of convinced that, bloodshed in the name of a classless paradise is preferable somehow to bloodshed in the name of racial purity.
Yeah.
And so that idea of progress.
But you go to the Magnificat. He's thrown down the mighty from their seat, he's exalted the humble and meek. You think, if that's what you had, if you built a moral system based on that, you would be much closer to, communist Russia than Nazi Germany, clearly. I mean, they're both bad, but so I do think that has got very deep Christian roots. And so there is a notion of progress in the Bible. I mean, where did Martin Luther King Jr. get his idea that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice? Well, he got it from Theodore Parker, who was a Christian preacher, who got it from the prophets, essentially, and got it from the fact of resurrection. Through the cross out, we come into something that, because we've gone down into that depth, actually there's a future that can be brighter than yesterday was. But that's a very different arc of the moral universe. Yes, it is.
That's down and then up.
Yes.
And I think where the sort of the 19th century kind of idea of progress that sort of filters through today is it's very much like the rainbow arc, that we can soar off into the distance and there's a pot of gold at the end of it. And someone like Martin Luther King Jr. believed in the arc that went in the other way. Yeah. And in a sense, he kind of embodied his own message because, I may not get there with you, he says the night before he dies, and then martyred, if you like, in the case of that. So Christians do believe in a kind of progress, but we do believe in a pole star that is above the party. Yes. Because it's very easy for the party to say, we're heading in this direction. It's the direction of historical inevitability. Yeah. Wait, well, it says who? Well, it says the party, right? Yeah. We do have a pole star, but we also have a path, don't we? Yeah. That is not, it's not the great leap forward, as Chairman Mao had, in which tens of millions of people died in the 1950s. Which should make us forever dubious of anyone's claims to progress. But I guess there is progress, but the way of progress is the way down and then up, the way of sacrificial love, the way of service, the way of suffering for death, the other, the way of death. And that's what we're called to as Christians. Let's finish with a question. Okay, we've talked about left and right and progressive and conservative and all that kind of stuff. Is this just a call for us all to be centrist dads? Right. Boring, slightly left of center, slightly right of center, on the political spectrum.
No, it absolutely isn't, because I think moderates often end up with the worst of all worlds on a lot of these issues, actually. I don't want to be moderate on slavery.
Right.
I don't want to be moderate on abortion. I don't want to be moderate on, whatever kind of most moral issues. There are a handful of issues, I expect, where I would find myself in the middle, and many listeners wouldn't be the same issues, but might find themselves in the middle on other issues. But no, I don't think you want to be in the middle of any other. One of the problems with saying I will perpetually try and be in the middle is that you end up simply being yanked around by whoever's the most extreme person. And this, I was introduced 5 years ago to the concept of the Overton window, but the idea, many people may well know it, but the idea that you sort of put polite discourse in a culture exists within a window of opinion, and that what you want to do if you want to change opinion is to make a statement that's outside the current bounds, and it'll pull the window towards you, even if no one believes what you're saying. The whole discourse will move the center of gravity. You end up being the victim of that all the time, and people make a lunatic statement on an issue and you have to move with them because the middle has changed. That's not what I'm not calling for that. I'm sure you're not. I think actually what it's more to say is that what Christianity does is provides a radical critique of both extremes, and that it does so from convictions that sometimes both extremes are trying to draw from, but have not got the theological or metaphysical grounds to make. And so you find yourself simultaneously at the far left and the far right, and everywhere in between. And so, as I said, I use the example of working in our local church, where I'd say actually in Britain today, and it might not be the same in every nation, but in Britain today, the center of gravity of my church would seem to be well on the left on issues of racial justice, would seem to be well on the right on issues of sexual ethics and pro-life, would seem to be various places in between on all sorts of other public policy issues. And that's not that you're then trying to find yourself in the middle. It's that you're saying, no, we're going to provide a radical, biblical, gospel-shaped critique of all the principalities and powers. Sometimes are trying to take us back to the past. Sometimes they're trying to take us to a completely unthinkable and unpreferable future. And all of those powers need to be exposed for what they are and what they're trying to achieve. And but that will sometimes make you sound like a very right-wing person, sometimes make you sound like a very left-wing person. And hopefully, often people say, I don't really know what that is. If that's a weird combination of, so you're opposed to war in that sense, and you're opposed to that sort of injustice, but you also seem to be very pro the rights of that group who are not part of the popular discourse. I can't quite place that on the map. Like we touched on before, you are in favor, it would seem, you're prepared to live with martyrdom and celibacy and charity and pity and humility and these things which don't really fit onto the left-right spectrum or whatever spectrum you care to mention. So no, I don't think we're moderates in that sense. I think we're just going to provide a radical challenge to all of the powers, whatever they may be pushing us to do.
Yeah, we're radicals. And if we sound like conservatives at some point, it's because we're trying to radically conserve the Jesus revolution. And if we sound like progressives in one sense, it's because we want to do this other thing of death and resurrection. And it's a radical challenge to the political discourse of this world. I just think of Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 14, it's the first time that the word Hebrew is mentioned, and it means one from beyond. And, perhaps it means one from beyond the river. And it's what the foreigners called the Israelites. They are from out of this world. And there is Abraham living in tents while the rest of the culture is at war. And it's this very, he doesn't fit. And sometimes he picks a side in the wars of his day, and sometimes he joins with the king of Sodom against the four kings, and he kind of enters the fray in that sense. But at the end of the day, he is building the household of faith, and he is from out of this world, and no one can kind of pin him down. So that's what Christians are, I guess. Right, well, we better draw stumps there, which is a cricket analogy for those who don't know about cricket. If you don't know about cricket, I'm very sorry for you.
But if you don't know about cricket, you probably haven't lived. So I think you're probably fine in not listening to this in the first place.
Christianity is obviously the cause of cricket. And
it is. And I often think of that scene at the end of the beach where Patterson Joseph stands there on the beach and says, these are the two twin pillars on which Western civilization is built, Christianity and cricket. And so we spent a lot of time talking about one of them. And it's just what we've got. Anyway, sorry, you have to give a formal outro to this episode.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so if you have enjoyed this episode, please do give us a share on social media and give us a rating and review on your podcatcher of choice. But Andrew Wilson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Glenn.